Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 13 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers thus far this season, so that we can determine the most advantageous matchups going into Week 13. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings as we approach Week 13. If you're looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you have yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to achieving our goal of 82,000 subscribers, and we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. So help me help you. Subscribe today. Thank you very much. Okay. Let's talk about wide receivers specifically in regards to matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 wide receiver receiving statistics allowed. So I've gone ahead and I've adjusted the spectrum of time from weeks 5 through 12 to determine that the Philadelphia Eagles, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Washington Commanders, New York Giants, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the wide receiver position in regards to statistics allowed via receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Because again, in regards to matchups, the rushing upside of a Deebo Samuel isn't determined on the secondary of that team in the overall coverage. That being said, as we progress, I will refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode in regards to some of the more advantageous matchups, but also some of the more disadvantageous matchups. Again, when we take our wide receivers and place them against the New York Jets defense, oftentimes, unless their names are Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, it's typically not going to be a great week. We'll have to wait and see what the capabilities of someone like Drake London for the Atlanta Falcons is. I mean, he is primarily the only wide receiver on that team that catches the ball. So hopefully he'll have himself a solid overall week. The Denver Broncos, New Orleans Saints, Baltimore Ravens, all playing well in the secondary. Of course, some of those teams on bye week, so we'll keep that in mind. Now that I've gone ahead and presented all these statistics, let's go ahead and transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Before I do so, reminder, rankings are always subject to change. Every single Sunday morning from 7 to 10 a.m., I live stream on the channel with updated rankings on screen. So be sure to swing on by. If you're not available, you can also go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy down in the description to get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. When you sign up using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get the first time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings, which are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex rankings for this Sunday and every subsequent Sunday for the remainder of the season, weeks 13 through 18. So take advantage of the opportunity by checking out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And of course, do so before Thursday's game between the Dallas Cowboys and Seattle Seahawks to take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Dak Prescott this week. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about our number one wide receiver for this week, of course. It is Tyreek Hill taking on the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders, since week 5, they are the third best matchup at the wide receiver position, nearly allowing 35 fantasy points per week in a half PPR scoring format. They've allowed the most receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers since week 5 in the National Football League, primarily because they haven't had a bye week throughout that entire stretch. But when we're talking about someone like Tyreek Hill, who leads the wide receiver position in terms of 100-yard receiving games thus far this season, he also leads the wide receiver position in terms of total touchdowns scored. He has scored 1 touchdown in 9 different games this season. Of course, he continues to play extremely well, and in a fantastic matchup, we're expecting 20 plus points in a half PPR scoring format. Our number 2 is CeeDee Lamb. I mean, amongst all the wide receivers in the National Football League, since the Dallas Cowboys have returned from their bye week, CeeDee Lamb has 24.6 fantasy points more than any other wide receiver. He continues to play well every single week, and mainly because he's finding himself in the end zone. CeeDee Lamb has scored 5 touchdowns in the last 5 games he has played. He continues to put up great numbers. They take on the Seattle Seahawks on Thursday night, and even though the Seattle Seahawks secondary has played well over the course of this season, over the course of the last 4 games, they've allowed 1 receiving touchdown in each of those games to an opposing wide receiver. I would anticipate that CeeDee Lamb finds the end zone. If not, there's a potential maybe Brandin Cooks, who we'll talk about in just a moment, will end up finding himself success considering how well the Dallas Cowboys offense continues to play after that bye week. On number 3, we have Keenan Allen. Of course, Keenan Allen is coming off of a week in which he had 14 receptions. Typically, you would think, okay, that's going to be your career high number, but Keenan Allen has accomplished 14 plus receptions in 5 other games throughout his entire career. So this isn't really something rare for Keenan Allen, having himself 16 targets, 14 receptions, 106 receiving yards. But as of right now, amongst the entire Los Angeles Chargers offense, really there's no one else that Justin Herbert trusts to send the ball in the direction to. I mean, again, with Josh Palmer out with an injury on the injury reserve, of course, soon to return, but Quentin Johnston obviously not living up to his first round, tag as of late. Guys like Jalen Guyton, again, this is a guy that was on the practice squad, wasn't really anticipated to be a contributor. Austin Eckler not getting enough utilization within the receiving position. The tight end position is a little bit in flux. A lot of injuries that have taken place to Gerald Everett, Donald Parham over the season. But nonetheless, the consistent through and through part of this offense is Keenan Allen. And going forward into this week's matchup against the New England Patriots, I anticipate him to, of course, have another great performance. On number 4, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown unfortunately broke the streak. Earlier this season from weeks 1 through 11, he had himself a consistent streak of either getting himself 100 receiving yards or 1 receiving touchdown in every single game, which was of course incredible. But unfortunately this last week came away with only 9 catches, 95 yards, 0 touchdowns. Was short on both of those overall markers, but nonetheless, still ended up scoring 14 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We really can't complain about that. Going into this week, they take on the New Orleans Saints. The Saints secondary is obviously in a little bit of trouble considering Marshawn Lattimore is on the injured reserve now. And on top of that, their primary nickel cornerback who covers slot receivers, Alontae Taylor, like I've mentioned over the course of this entire season, he has been subject to a lot of, coverage breaks thus far this season. Over the course of the year, Alontae Taylor has allowed the most receptions and receiving yards to slot receiving options against him. My expectation, Amon-Ra St. Brown should have himself a fantastic performance. Moving on to the A tier. To begin our number 5, we have the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Mike Evans. Mike Evans coming off an incredible performance, 6 catches, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns. Thus far this season, he has scored 1 touchdown in 8 of the 10 healthy games he has played with Baker Mayfield. Even with Baker Mayfield last week, obviously exiting the game with an ankle injury and returning. Obviously, there was a little bit of question as to whether or not Kyle Trask could potentially help this offense. Obviously, Baker Mayfield didn't leave that up to question. He came back, he returned, and obviously elevated the potential of Mike Evans. We have already heard earlier this week from head coach Todd Bowles that Baker Mayfield should be good to go, and we do trust that the idea is he's going to get himself, probably limited participation in some of these overall practices. They're going to rehab his overall ankle. He should be good to go, taking on the Carolina Panthers. The last time Mike Evans took on the Carolina Panthers, week 17 of last season with Tom Brady, of course, but in that game, 10 catches, 207 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns in 2022. Going into this week's game, there is a potential in which CJ Henderson and JC Horn, the primary number 1 and number 2 cornerbacks of this defense, could end up missing considering they both missed last week. If that's going to be the case, Mike Evans should be an incredible play this week. Moving on to our number 6, we have A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown in the last 2 games has been very lackluster, 45 total receiving yards in the last 2 games. But we know he's one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, and we have to start him regardless because we know his overall potential for upside. Even though he only had himself 37 receiving yards last week, 5 catches, still found himself in the end zone scoring a touchdown. That's what we have to hope for this week, taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Even though the 49ers, since their bye week, have played significantly better, especially in the secondary, there is an opportunity here for A.J. Brown to get back on track. There is a little bit of a potential in which this game could be a rain game. Once again, it is being played in Philly. We'll have to keep that monitor over the course of the week, but regardless, we have to start A.J. Brown in every circumstance for the remainder of the season. On number 7 is Calvin Ridley. I think Calvin Ridley's pretty much proven us that with Zay Jones, we have to start him. In the 5 games this season in which Zay Jones has been active, Calvin Ridley is averaging 17.68 half PPR fantasy points per game. It's madness to believe that just one player opposite side of the field of him could open up so much more in terms of the receiving game, but we have to trust the madness. We just have to continue with the overall idea that he's going to continue to get himself utilization and, of course, finds himself in the end zone. He's the leading receiver in terms of total targets and touchdowns within the red zone for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I'm expecting them to continue to look in his direction, especially this week taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals secondary last week was without Cameron Taylor-Britt, their primary number 1 cornerback. If, in fact, he's going to miss another consecutive week, it only makes it easier to start Calvin Ridley. On number 8 for this week is Jaylen Waddle. The primary determining factor as to whether or not Jaylen Waddle finds success is opportunity. And I talk about it all the time. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. In the 5 games this season in which Jaylen Waddle has had himself 8 or more targets, he's averaging 14.22 half PPR fantasy points per game. But the issue is he doesn't get himself 8+ targets every single week. But hopefully, going into this weekend's matchup against the Washington Commanders, there is potential, especially considering the Washington Commanders are the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position. Of course, they're nearly allowing 35 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in terms of receiving statistics isolated. Of course, have allowed the most receiving touchdowns since week 5 to opposing wide receivers. The expectation would be another big game here for Jaylen Waddle. I mean, he's coming off a performance against the most difficult matchup in which he had 8 targets, 8 catches, 114 through the air. That was the 2nd time this season in which he's had over 100 receiving yards. He was able to accomplish that 6 different times in 2022. So hopefully we'll get far more consistency and far more 100 receiving yard games for Jaylen Waddle going forward. Our number 9 for this week, the rookie wide receiver Tank Dell, who last week, unfortunately, had himself a 60-yard reception called back. a little bit of a pre-snap penalty in which they assumed that while he was motioning, he was going forward instead of going parallel to the line of scrimmage. It is what it is. 60 yards taken off his overall total. Could have had himself over 100 receiving yards once again, but what he was able to get was another consecutive game of scoring a touchdown. He has had 4 consecutive games of scoring 1 touchdown minimum. Ends up with 14.7 fantasy points. Now it takes on the Denver Broncos. It is the second toughest matchup at the position, but considering he's the number 1 or 2 wide receiver, whichever way you see it, whether it's him or Nico Collins, as long as he's a primary option of CJ Stroud, who's playing extremely well thus far this season, he of course has himself a lot of upside going into this weekend's matchup, regardless of the fact that they'll be taking on the Denver Broncos. Our number 10 for this week is Michael Pittman Jr. In 6 of the last 7 games, he has played with a starting Gardner Minshew. He's been able to surpass 8 or more receptions. Last week, I think it was either Friday or Saturday live stream, we went ahead and put Michael Pittman Jr. in with a couple of those pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. His number for some reason was at 6.0 receptions. Obviously, he came away with a performance of 13 targets, 10 catches for 107. I mean, thus far this season, in the last 6 games in which I'm talking about, in which he's had 8 or more receptions, he's been able to put up a top 20 wide receiver performance in a half PPR scoring format. Obviously, he's a reliable fantasy option. That will continue to be the case, especially going into this week's matchup against the Tennessee Titans. The Titans cannot stop the run. Zach Moss is going to find success, and when he does, the play action game is going to open up for Gardner Minshew to look in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr. Our number 11 is Chris Olave. Now, the surprising thing that I saw earlier today in regards to the reports was that Chris Olave was participating in practice. Now, if in fact the concussion protocol is going to be cleared for this upcoming Sunday, taking on the Detroit Lions, we have to remember that last week, Chris Olave was dominating within this game. 9 targets, 7 catches, 114. The 7 catches for 114 receiving yards were all done in the first half of that game. The first target he saw in the second half obviously sustained his injury and was removed. Now, if in fact we're going to continue this offense with Rashid Shaheed potentially missing with the thigh injury, and of course we already know that Michael Thomas is on the injured reserve, if Chris Olave is the only dependable wide receiver out on the field, against the Detroit Lions, who since week 5 are the 5th best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 32.64 fantasy points per game. So going into this week, if he's able to clear concussion protocol, an automatic start as a wide receiver 1. On number 12 for this week, we have Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel, in 2 out of the last 3 games, he has scored a rushing touchdown. Specifically this last week against the Seattle Seahawks, Thanksgiving Day. They lined him up in the backfield. They motioned in Christian McCaffrey. They had a little bit of an option in which they could have handed it off to Deebo Samuel or pitched it to Christian McCaffrey. They handed it off to Deebo Samuel. He runs in for an easy touchdown. As long as they continue to give him these opportunities, his overall upside will continue to increase. On top of the fact that they gave him 9 opportunities within the receiving game. 9 targets for 7 catches, 79 receiving yards. In comparison to Brandin Aiyuk on the opposite side of the field, who only had 2 receptions within that game. Obviously, late in that game, was able to save his performance with the receiving touchdown. But nonetheless, as long as they continue to give Deebo Samuel opportunity, success will be found. This week, they take on the best matchup at the wide receiver position, the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, Stephon Diggs was able to get back on track last week. Gabe Davis was able to get back on track last week against this defense, even in a rain game. I'm anticipating that Deebo Samuel should be a fantastic play here in the top 12 capacity. Moving on to our number 13, the other half of this conversation in which I just mentioned. Last week, Brandin Aiyuk was barely able to save his overall performance with a receiving touchdown late in the game, but we'll take it. That's 3 consecutive weeks in which he has scored a minimum of 1 touchdown. And as long as he continues to get these opportunities in a game against the best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 37.93 fantasy points per game on a weekly basis since week 5 to opposing wide receivers. And like I just mentioned, both Stephon Diggs and Gabriel Davis, who were having themselves, very lackluster performances prior to the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, they were able to get back on track considering how easy the matchup was overall. And Gabe Davis even had an opportunity of scoring a game-winning touchdown in overtime, wasn't able to haul that in. Nonetheless, I expect Brandin Aiyuk, this passing game for the San Francisco 49ers, to be featured. And even though, Brandin Aiyuk isn't getting as many receptions as Christian McCaffrey on a per game basis, we know that there's always touchdown upside when he's given said opportunity. Moving on to our number 14, on the other side of this matchup, we have DeVonta Smith taking on the San Francisco 49ers defense. Of course, like I've mentioned relentlessly over the course of the last 2 to 3 weeks now, in the absence of Dallas Goedert, DeVonta Smith continues to get himself a high level of opportunity and continues to play well. Over the course of the last 7 games in which DeVonta Smith has played without Dallas Goedert, whether that be in 2022 or in 2023, in those 7 games, he has had 8 targets minimum per game and is averaging 14.21 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of an unstoppable performance of 7 catches, 106 and a touchdown. I mean, even the week prior to that, had himself a reception that was down at the 1-yard line, could have also had a touchdown the previous week. There's a lot of potential in which DeVonta Smith very easily surpasses the number 14 overall ranking this week. Number 15, we have Nico Collins. On the other side of this overall conversation, we just mentioned Tank Dell moments ago. Nico Collins was finally able to get himself back into the conversation of being potentially the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. He was able to out-target and out-receive Tank Dell for the first time in quite a while, but nonetheless, was able to get himself 9 targets, 7 catches, 104, and a touchdown. That touchdown definitely makes a huge difference, but as long as this offense continues to play as well as they have, and as long as they continue to prioritize allowing CJ Stroud to lead them to the promised land, these statistics are not going to be rare going forward. This week, they take on the second toughest matchup at the wide receiver position. We know that there are some potential rumors in regards to Noah Brown returning this week. Even if he does, he's still going to be the number 3 wide receiver who is going to be splitting opportunities with Robert Woods going forward. Nonetheless, Nico Collins has played extremely well since returning from his injury, and as long as he continues to be incorporated as a number 1 or 2 option within this offense, regardless of the matchup, should be a fantastic play this week. Our number 16 for this week is DK Metcalf. I understand that his performance last week was extremely underwhelming, but 9 targets were there. We cannot deny the fact that the opportunities went in his direction. But I will admit that when watching this game back, a lot of those opportunities that were sent in the direction of DK Metcalf from Geno Smith were turnover-worthy plays or just off-target in general. Now, hopefully, that injury that Geno Smith was dealing with last week can go ahead and recover from last Thursday going into this Thursday's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. We know that the Dallas Cowboys matchup specifically for wide receivers hasn't been great. It's the 6th toughest amongst all teams, but they've given up their fair share of points. It's not impossible to score on guys like Stephon Gilmore or Deron Bland, who continue to, score touchdowns himself. But going into this week, it's just a matter of, can DK Metcalf continue to see himself a high level of opportunity? He has had himself 9 targets in 5 of the last 6 games he has played. I'm expecting that number to stay consistent. We just have to hope that Geno Smith can play far better this week. Our number 17 this week is Courtland Sutton. I have a hard time not ranking Courtland Sutton highly, especially in an advantageous matchup at the wide receiver position. Since week 5, the Houston Texans are allowing nearly 29 fantasy points per game, the 9th best matchup at the wide receiver position. Amongst all Denver Broncos receiving options, Courtland Sutton is really the only one that we can depend upon, and primarily because he continues to score touchdowns. Prior to this last week's performance against the Cleveland Browns, which of course we never really expected him to perform well, considering how well that defense has played over the course of the season, there were a couple of defensive pass interference calls, which could have led to yardage for Courtland Sutton. Was able to still get himself 3 catches for 61. But prior to this last weekend's performance, he had 5 consecutive games of scoring a receiving touchdown. Thus far this season, he has scored 8 receiving touchdowns as a member of this offense. If that continues to trend in the right direction, going up against the Houston Texans should have himself another great performance as the Denver Broncos continue to string together victories. On number 18 and number 19 for this week is Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. First and foremost, both of their values for fantasy are connected. They take on the Cleveland Browns this week. That's the 7th toughest matchup at the position. They're only allowing 22 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's not a great matchup overall, especially considering the fact that the Cleveland Browns secondary amongst all defenses over the course of the season have allowed the fewest passing yards. So that in itself doesn't make it easy to start Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. On top of the fact that Cooper Kupp, 5 consecutive games of fewer than 6 fantasy points. I understand that some of these games he's been injured. He's left the game early. Last week, obviously, still played 88% of the offensive snaps, but only got himself 3 receptions, 18 receiving yards, as the entire kind of game script was, let's get Tyler Higbee the ball and let's get Kyren Williams the ball. And it obviously led to success. If this week we're in a similar situation in which, of course, they don't require the services of Cooper Kupp to be at an elite level, same thing with Puka Nacua, it's just tough to trust both of these guys. Both of them coming off of lackluster performances. Cooper Kupp, 5 targets, 3 catches, 18 yards. At least Puka Nacua had 8 targets, 4 catches, 27. A little bit better. It's not impossible to score against this team. We have seen Tyler Lockett and JSN a couple weeks back score against this defense in the same game. Josh Downs and Michael Pittman Jr. both able to score against this defense in the same game. That, the Josh Downs touchdown was a broken coverage touchdown, and Michael Pittman Jr. somehow broke 3 tackles for a touchdown. Either way, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to trust them going into this week. Number 20, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Speaking of difficult to trust, Ja'Marr Chase is coming off of a week in which he had only 6 targets, 4 catches, 81. One of those receptions for 31 yards on a tipped pass. If it wasn't for that reception, we were in trouble last week. Was able to get himself 10.1 fantasy points, fantastic, but 6 targets is not enough, especially when we take into account that T. Higgins was inactive. Now, we don't know whether or not T. Higgins is going to be active this week, but we know that they're taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, a defense that is the 6th best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 31.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers since week 5. So if in fact Ja'Marr Chase is going to at least get himself a little bit more opportunity, especially considering you go back to the last couple weeks. Aiden O'Connell for the Las Vegas Raiders, a backup quarterback, sure, but he was able to finally learn, hey, I got to send the ball in the direction of my number one wide receiver. We got to continue to get Devontae Adams double-digit opportunities every single week. Hopefully, we can get Jake Browning on that overall kind of trend of funnel targeting Jamar Chase because he's always effing open, and hopefully that'll be enough to solidify him as a wide receiver 2 option. Number 21, we have Adam Thielen. Now, we've talked about it earlier this week in regards to the firing of Frank Reich, the quarterbacks coach Josh McCown, and the running backs coach Deuce Staley. There's a lot of coach movement here. And honestly, the fact that Adam Thielen's coming off a performance in which he had 3 targets, some of those firings may be deserved. If you're only targeting your number one wide receiver option 3 times within a singular game, something definitely needs to change in that overall equation. So hopefully going into this week, we're going to get more opportunity in the direction of Adam Thielen. Of course, they're taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's the second best matchup at the wide receiver position. They're allowing nearly 36 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. When you look at the other wide receivers implicated within this offense, DJ Chark, Jonathan Mingo, really, are these guys going to compete with Adam Thielen for targets? I hope not, because really they haven't proved that they can go ahead and deliver even when given opportunity thus far this season. So I'm hoping for Adam Thielen to get himself a far more expanded role, see more targets within this offense, and of course, deliver for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our 22, we have Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin is associated with an offense that throws the ball a bunch. In the last 6 consecutive games, Sam Howell has thrown the ball 42 or more times. It has ranged from 42 passing attempts to 45 to 52, even in some circumstances. Taking on the Miami Dolphins, the expectation would be that the Miami Dolphins are going to score early and often, and when they do, it'll force Sam Howell and the Washington Commanders offense, as they love to do considering they are number 1 in the National Football League in terms of passing percentage, in terms of pass rate, passing attempts in comparison to rushing attempts. As long as they continue to pass the ball at a high clip, we're talking about the last 6 weeks in which Terry McLaurin within this offense is getting himself a 20% target share. Not the greatest number, but we'll still take it. As long as the opportunity is there coming off a week in which he had 11 targets, that's all we can ask for. I understand that he hasn't scored very many touchdowns as of late. 1 in the last 6 games, has only been able to surpass 70 yards in 2 of the last 6 games. Not great numbers as of late, but the opportunity is there. And if they're going to be throwing for majority of the contest, I'm hoping against the Miami Dolphins he can put together a solid performance. Our number 23 for this week, Marquise Brown, finally was able to get himself an ample level of opportunity. 12 targets, 6 catches, 88 yards. We're getting back to the frequency of targets in which Kyler Murray demonstrated early last season when Marquise Brown was his number 1 receiving option. And considering how bad the Arizona Cardinals offense has played over the course of the last couple weeks, hopefully we'll continue to see Marquise Brown, especially going up against a team that he's familiar with when he was with the Baltimore Ravens, took on the Pittsburgh Steelers on multiple occasions over the course of the season. Hopefully his familiarity against that defense and the overall opportunity of a negative game script can continue to increase his touches and hopefully get himself closer to scoring a touchdown this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 24, we have Garrett Wilson. Now, luckily, even with Tim Boyle and how badly he played, we still saw Garrett Wilson get himself 10 targets, 7 catches. Now, only 44 receiving yards. Luckily, was able to get himself a touchdown to save his overall fantasy performance for 13.9 fantasy points. Earlier today, we had seen a little bit of a clip in which Aaron Rodgers, at practice, he was dropping back, making some passes, and he was looking good. There is a potential in which Aaron Rodgers could return for the fantasy playoffs to help boost Garrett Wilson's overall numbers. Either way, going into this week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Even with Tim Boyle as their starting quarterback, I would hope that he continues to funnel target Garrett Wilson. Last week, we saw Derek Carr funnel target Chris Olave in the first half of that game. In the first half, 7 catches, 114. There is potential for Garrett Wilson to have himself a solid performance as a wide receiver 2 with upside. Moving on to our number 25, we have Rashee Rice, who set himself career highs. Obviously, he's a rookie, but, I guess career season, same thing. Season high, career high, targets with 10, receptions with 8, receiving yards with 107, and scored himself a receiving touchdown. Now, that receiving touchdown was a 39-yard catch and run to the end zone. Fantastic. This week, they take on the Green Bay Packers. That secondary is still in shambles in regards to all the injuries that they are dealing with. On top of the fact that the Chiefs offense is dealing with a lot of injuries themselves. Jerick McKinnon, Kadarius Toney, McCole Hardman. If they continue to miss another consecutive week, it opens up more opportunity for Rashee Rice to continue to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense. And we have heard it from a guy like Andy Reid, their head coach, their primary play caller. Rashee Rice is starting to really learn how to be a receiver for Patrick Mahomes. He's being more Patrick Mahomes friendly which was in Andy Reid's words. So we'll see how that kind of continues, and hopefully the targets continue to go in his direction. Our number 26 is Amari Cooper. I wanted to mention Amari Cooper primarily because a couple of the reports that we heard earlier this morning in regards to Dorian Thompson-Robinson being the starter, but he's currently in concussion protocol. If he was going to miss, Joe Flacco's already been elevated to being the second string quarterback. So if in fact DTR misses, which he missed practice today, obviously still in concussion protocol typically makes you miss at least 1 week. So if he misses this week, Joe Flacco will be the starter. We have to put into perspective that if DTR does end up starting, clearing concussion protocol, thus far this season, Amari Cooper with DTR, 2 catches for 16, 1 catch for 16. He has done nothing in the 2 games in which DTR has been the starter. So let's hope that's not the case. But if Joe Flacco is a starting quarterback, I mean, Amari Cooper over the course of the last 2 seasons with the Cleveland Browns, regardless of who the quarterback has been, whether that's Jacoby Brissett, PJ Walker, Deshaun Watson, it doesn't matter. They have all played well with Amari Cooper, and Amari Cooper obviously plays extremely well in those overall circumstances, taking on a matchup which is top 12 at the position since week 5. Hopefully, Joe Flacco is ready to go ahead and elevate the potential of Amari Cooper this week. Moving on to our number 27, we have Josh Downs, coming off a performance in which he had just as many targets as Michael Pittman Jr. 13 targets, only 5 catches for 43 receiving yards, but the opportunity is there. Thus far this season with a starting Gardner Minshew when Josh Downs has been healthy and played over 50% of the offensive snaps, he's averaging 11.76 fantasy points per game. Back in week 5 against the Tennessee Titans, 6 catches on 6 targets for 97 receiving yards. 12.7 fantasy points. I'm expecting another great performance here from this Indianapolis Colts offense. And of course, Josh Downs this week. Moving on to Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk is very similar to Josh Downs in the idea that, outside of being in a full PPR scoring format, again, the rankings on screen are for a half PPR. If you're talking about a full PPR scoring format, fantastic must-start option every single week because he has the potential. But in a half PPR, he's a wide receiver 3 that has the potential of scoring himself, a touchdown, maybe gets himself a huge yardage play. It's all on the table, but as of late, the entire offense has kind of shifted over the course of the last 2 games with Zay Jones returning. In the 5 games this season in which Zay Jones has been active, Christian Kirk is only averaging 9.3 fantasy points per game. In the 6 games in which, Zay Jones has been inactive or left early with an injury or something of that extent, he's averaging over 12 fantasy points per game, 12.03 to be exact. There's a huge difference there. 3+ fantasy points one way or the other in a half PPR is a big deal. But as of right now, still a upper tier option as a wide receiver 3. Moving on to our number 29, we have Diontae Johnson. Still going to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense. I know that, of course, Pat Freiermuth getting himself a high volume of targets last week could end up continuing throughout that entire circumstance, especially considering they play against the Arizona Cardinals this week. But that Arizona Cardinals matchup, even for wide receivers, is extremely advantageous. The 8th best at the position, allowing 30.41 fantasy points per game since week 5. If, in fact, Diontae Johnson continues to see himself a high level of opportunity, I mean, he had 8 targets last week, not a bad number. If it wasn't for the fact that he dropped that touchdown, that he had both feet down, unfortunately wasn't able to complete the reception. If, in fact, he scores that 15-yard touchdown, the narrative is completely different in regards to Diontae Johnson in comparison to the guy that obviously watches Jaylen Warren fumble and doesn't even react to it. Either way, I anticipate him to get more opportunity going into this week to, of course, be fantasy relevant. Let's begin with our number 30, Tyler Lockett. He takes on the Dallas Cowboys. Of course, when you take on the Dallas Cowboys, in order to compete for a victory, I mean, the Seattle Seahawks may end up going on a streak here in which they lose 3 consecutive games, considering, of course, tough matchups across the board. LA Rams, obviously last week against San Francisco 49ers, now take on another juggernaut within the NFC against the Dallas Cowboys. If you want to win, you got to throw for majority of the game. You have to get a lot of incorporation out of Tyler Lockett. Thus far this season, in games in which we have seen Tyler Lockett get himself, 8 to 9 targets, he's been extremely relevant. Specifically, 8+ targets in 5 games, averaging 15.26 fantasy points per game. In games in which he has seen less than 8 targets, 6 games in those scenarios, 5.7 fantasy points per game. He needs to see opportunity. Hopefully, this will be a contest in which they're throwing for majority of the game and hopefully looking in the direction of Tyler Lockett. Our number 31 is DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins earlier this season against the Indianapolis Colts had himself an incredible performance of 11 targets, 8 catches, and 140 receiving yards. It was with a different quarterback, but still an incredible performance. Now, the thing about DeAndre Hopkins is that anytime he takes on the Indianapolis Colts, whether that has been with the Arizona Cardinals, whether that has been with the Houston Texans, in the last 5 consecutive games prior to earlier this season, in which he took on the Indianapolis Colts in week 5, the 5 prior games against the Colts, a former division rival for him, he's had himself a touchdown minimum. He continues to find himself incredible performances against this defense, a defense that cannot stop the run since week 5. If this is going to be a back and forth experience, hopefully we'll see far more utilization out of DeAndre Hopkins. As of late with Will Levis, really hasn't seen himself in an elite level of opportunity as he should every single week, regardless of whether or not those are good targets. 5 targets, 3 catches, 49 is not acceptable, especially when you have a wide receiver like DeAndre Hopkins on the outside. Moving on to our number 32, we have Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed, as of late, last 3 games, 16.9, 17.2, 13.0, has scored a touchdown, whether it's on the ground or through the air, in each game, 1 minimum. Since week 7, he's the number 22 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. So why do I have him at number 32? Well, there's always the potential taking on the Kansas City Chiefs that this matchup is far more impactful than we, potentially anticipate. And with so many receiving options within this offense that are capable of scoring just like Jayden Reed within a given week, it does make it difficult to trust just one guy. Now, speaking of this offense, we have Christian Watson as our number 33. Christian Watson this last week began the game, first play of the game, a 50-yard reception down the field. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that Jordan Love threw the ball short, Christian Watson had to come back for that ball. If he throws it even further and lets Christian Watson go get it, he's walking into the end zone to begin the game on the first play. I mean, we know that this is a wide receiver that has incredible speed, 4.3, 4.40 speed. As long as you give him opportunities down the field, he's going to be able to be a successful player. Now, thus far this season, amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League, Jordan Love is tied with Josh Allen in terms of passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. Now, even though he hasn't been efficient with those overall opportunities, as long as he continues to give opportunities of those capacity to Christian Watson, he will be relevant for fantasy purposes. In the last couple weeks, it's been very difficult to trust Christian Watson within a given contest, but now that he's beginning to score touchdowns, get more opportunity, it does make it a little bit easier to potentially trust him as a wide receiver 3 option going into the given week. Moving on to our number 34, we have Brandin Cooks. Speaking of trusting him a little bit more, Brandin Cooks has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 6 games. Now, I understand, very touchdown dependent, but taking on the Seattle Seahawks, there is a potential in which he could end up scoring a touchdown. But there's also the chance that it could be CeeDee Lamb, it could be Turpin, it could be Jalen Tolbert, Michael Gallup, Jake Ferguson, maybe the backup tight end. Maybe it's, Tony Pollard. Maybe it's the backup running back, Rico Dowdle. There are so many threats within this offense that can score in any given week. It definitely does make it, very scary to start any Dallas Cowboys option, especially considering we have seen streaks of time in which Tony Pollard didn't score a touchdown. So anybody can be capable of being touchdown void within a given week within the Dallas Cowboys offense. That being said, Brandin Cooks continues to prove himself as the number 2 option. And even though there is a high risk, high reward factor to this, considering we're in a bipocalypse, I'm willing to take the risk, take it on the Seattle Seahawks secondary in week 13. Moving on to our number 35, we have Drake London. Drake London is really the only viable wide receiver within this offense. He might be the only viable receiving option. I understand that earlier today, Arthur Smith came out and said that, yes, Kyle Pitts is a major part of this offense. We're going to get a more incorporation, There's only so much I can believe in regards to his overall public statements. That being said, amongst all the wide receivers within this offense, just going back to last week, Van Jefferson had 1 reception. Scotty Miller had 1 reception. Nobody else had a reception outside of Drake London, who had 5 catches on 7 targets for 91 receiving yards. A great overall game. With Desmond Ridder, is very easily able to average over 11 fantasy points per game over the course of this season. Hopefully that'll continue to be the case, even though that they're taking on the New York Jets secondary. We'll just have to wait and see whether the coverage is too much for, of course, this quarterback and Drake London. Our number 36 is Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel, of course, it is in a rotation with a lot of wide receivers. Typically, you see about 6 or 7 wide receivers take the field and get targets within a singular week for the Washington Commanders. And considering they're throwing the ball 42 to 50 times per game over the course of the last 6 weeks, it's not really a surprise, especially with Curtis Samuel dealing with himself injuries and being ejected a couple weeks ago. Nonetheless, coming off a performance in which he had 12 targets, 9 catches, 100 receiving yards, we're hoping that he'll get back to that overall level of opportunity. Probably not going to see himself 12 targets once again, but as long as he's able to get himself 7 to 8 targets, have himself the touchdown upside that he typically does within this offense, should be a solid play in a high-scoring event in which, of course, his team will be in a negative game script. Moving on to our number 37, we have Greg Dortch. If Michael Wilson is going to miss another consecutive game, primarily because the Arizona Cardinals have a Week 14 bye week, there is a potential in which Greg Dortch should see himself a lot of opportunity. For 2 consecutive games in the absence of Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch has had himself 17 total targets. Has been fantasy relevant in both those games, scoring over 10 fantasy points. Should be a solid option as a wide receiver 3, but the primary question is whether or not Michael Wilson is active this week. All right, moving on to our number 38, we have George Pickens. Again, George Pickens is a big playmaking threat in any given week. The only thing is, are they going to give him the opportunity to make those plays, especially when we're in a scenario against the Arizona Cardinals that can't stop the run, can't stop the pass, can't stop tight ends, can't stop anybody. Anybody can score this week for the Pittsburgh Steelers. As to whether or not George Pickens sees enough opportunity, I don't think he'll get himself enough targets in comparison to guys like Diontae Johnson or Pat Freiermuth. He'll probably be the number 3 receiving option of this offense, and considering how much this team prioritizes the running game, may end up being the number 5 option within this offense overall within the week. Moving on to our number 39, we have Jahan Dotson. Jahan Dotson has scored 3 touchdowns in the last 5 games, but there are some weeks in which he just completely disappears. That is the biggest issue that I have with Jahan Dotson. In the weeks in which he was scoring touchdowns, being a great overall fantasy product, unfortunately, it was the weeks in which Curtis Samuel was absent. Now that Curtis Samuel's back, obviously Jahan Dotson last week only had 7.7 fantasy points, finished as the number 41 overall wide receiver within the game, week and a half PPR. I think that as long as he continues to see himself opportunity in an offense that is throwing the ball a plethora of times, he will still be of value. He'll still have an opportunity of a touchdown, but it's not as solidified as it was in weeks past. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention, it is Elijah Moore. Like I mentioned earlier, if Dorian Thompson-Robinson cannot clear concussion protocol and Joe Flacco is the starter, my anticipation would be that Elijah Moore should be a top 40 play at the wide receiver position. We have seen that Joe Flacco and him have built rapport back in 2022 with the New York Jets. On top of it, in the last 2 games in which Elijah Moore has played with DTR, 3 catches for 44, 2 catches for 20. Let's hope that Joe Flacco is the starting quarterback in order to elevate these wide receivers this week. All right, guys, that's going to cover for me today in regards to wide receiver rankings for week 13. I'll be back tomorrow with tight end and quarterback rankings before the Thursday night game. Of course, I'll also have a couple pick'em slips in regards to tomorrow's episode. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy if you guys want my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Link down in the description. Use code Andrew. Make one first-time deposit of $10, and you're good to go for the remainder of the season. From my email directly to yours, be sure to check your spam folder. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.